One or two words of introduction again to Lamentations. We know that the background is the year 587 BC. The crisis that's brought this book into being is the fall of Jerusalem. The Babylonians have ended their siege. It's been long and bitter. And the city has suffered tremendously. And now as the Babylonians come into the city, they wreck virtually everything, not least the temple itself. And that great edifice has been razed to the ground. A number of people have been marched off into exile. They're in Babylon for the foreseeable future. For some of them, they'll never return. We can see the exile from the end. We know that it was about 70 years in duration, but of course, they didn't know that at the beginning, and 70 years was a lot longer than life expectancy in those days. So perhaps those who were taken into exile never saw their beloved homeland again. The destruction of the temple meant far more than just the demolition of a building. It's hard for us to envisage just how traumatic that must have been. Jeremiah says there was a kind of false temple theology that had built up in those days. Whenever he challenged them with the word of the Lord, the people said, well, the temple's there, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. If you read Jeremiah, it was a little litany, but it was entirely false, of course. Their reasoning behind it was that if the temple was there, they were safe. At the end of the day, it didn't really matter what they did or didn't do. The temple was there, and the temple represented the Lord's physical presence. So if he was there, then whoever came against them inevitably would be defeated and sent running. But that theology had been turned upside down and inside out by the time Lamentations came into being. Now, the second chapter of Lamentations in many ways is like the first. You could say more of the same thing. It's exactly the same length, 22 verses. And those 22 verses are not there by coincidence. They are there representing an acrostic based on the Hebrew alphabet. There are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. There are 22 verses in the second chapter of Lamentations. Chapter 3 is a little bit different, and we'll be talking about that next time. But these 22 verses do introduce us to one or two themes that we haven't really found yet in the book. One of the themes that they reiterate is the theme of grief and loss. And we have produced a little worksheet, which some of you have and some of you haven't. It reads simply, how do you and your family deal with grief and loss? What loss do you think about when the word is mentioned? When you suffer loss, do you move on as quickly as possible? Do you try and replace what was lost with something new? Do you review your loss in the privacy of your own thinking? Or do you find it helpful to share your sense of loss with others? Do you cry out to God with raw emotion? Or whatever? And one of the great themes of Lamentation is that grief is real. It's not something to be swept under the carpet. It's not something to be ignored. It's not something to be minimized. Sometimes when we face loss in our lives, we feel a little bit guilty about it. I've met at times people who said, well, if you suffer loss, the Lord is obviously treating you with love and care, and he's teaching you things, and I feel the acuteness of that loss. But I don't believe that's in harmony with Scripture at all. When Paul talks about grief in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, he says, we do not grieve as others do who have no hope, but the implication is that we still grieve. Perhaps there's something wrong if we don't. But two things I'd like to say about the grief that's reflected in the book of Lamentations. The first thing is this, that it's corporate grief. If you read the text very carefully, you will see that great chunks of it are not just an expression of personal grief. This is an individual who's grieving, but this is the nation speaking. This is the city of Jerusalem speaking. Some very vivid pictures are used in these chapters. The picture of a woman who has been abused, sitting by the wayside and no one comes to her help. The picture of someone who is dirty and obviously fallen on hard times. Some of these pictures are almost offensive in their rawness. It's a very real expression of guilt, but it's corporate grief. It's the grief of the nation. We may want to come back to that little question that we posed a few moments ago and say, is it helpful to share grief? How do we share something as personal as grief? Is it appropriate to do so? I was telling Sharon earlier today that I only really saw my mother break down once, and that was some years after the death of my father. She had a view of grief that simply meant that she kept it to herself. I'm sure she did share with one or two people, but as a child she certainly didn't share it with me. When my sister died and I was only 12, I wasn't even allowed to go to the funeral. Something I've regretted over the years, and I don't think that would be the way of things today. Now, I'm not saying that children should always be present at funerals, but I'd actually seen my older sister die, and I couldn't understand what was so awful about a funeral, but it was all part of this view that grief was something that was kept in its place. You didn't share it. Well, that's not the theology of Lamentations. There's grief and grief aplenty here. But it's not just personal loss, corporate grief. It's the grief of the nation. But the theme that emerges in chapter 2 is, I think, more disturbing than just the presence of grief. And it's this theology that somehow God has brought all this about. That somehow the fall of Jerusalem is a punishment. It's a fulfillment of prophecies that were uttered over the years. It's interesting that the meditation that Margaret introduced this afternoon asks similar questions. Is this virus part of God's creation? If we trot off a text like God does all things well, what about this? Is God ultimately the author of evil things? These are perennial questions. And the book of Lamentations doesn't purport to have an easy answer, but it does have some difficult theology at this point. Because it says quite clearly in a number of places that this destruction of the city is actually the judgment of God on sin. I'm not suggesting that we go out from a Bible study like this and start preaching on Sunday. But what is happening to us is God's judgment on sin. I don't think it's as simple as that by a million miles. But this is what we encounter in Lamentations. Perhaps we need to ask ourselves the question, was the writer of Lamentations getting it wrong? Is his view of God a primitive view of God that's been completely surpassed and eclipsed by what we understand of God's revelation in Jesus Christ? But we do need to confront this, because it would be simplistic to say that in the Old Testament God is a God of wrath and anger, and in the New Testament he's a God of love. It's not quite as simple as that. We love the 3rd chapter of John's Gospel, don't we? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. But that chapter actually ends, John 3 verse 36, with the statement that if we don't turn to Christ, the wrath of God remains upon us. What is this wrath of God? Is God capricious? Is God a bad-tempered being who flies off the handle at the slightest provocation? That's not the revelation that we get in the New Testament, where John says in his first letter, quite unequivocally, God is love. How then do we reconcile the love of God with the wrath of God? The Apostle Paul, wrestling with this issue in Romans, seems to suggest that when we deliberately live as if God does not matter and regard him as irrelevant, we place ourselves in a position where that judgment almost is brought upon us by our own actions. But let's try and grapple with it. I recognise that this is a chapter about the grief of the people and about the wrath of the Lord. And like the bar of bitter chocolate, taste it now and again. But for goodness sake, don't try and eat it all at one sitting.